The story behind the headlines. The National Broadcasting Company, in cooperation with the American Historical Association, again presents Caesar Searchinger, noted foreign correspondent and writer, in an informal analysis of the news. With the assistance of a research panel of eminent historians, Mr. Searchinger retraces the events of the past to help you in arriving at a fuller understanding of what is happening today. Copies of these talks are available to our radio audience at the cost of 10 cents. Send 10 cents in coin or stamps to the story behind the headlines, National Broadcasting Company, Post Office Box 30, Station J, New York City. Mr. Searchinger's subject tonight is the riddle of the Straits. Mr. Searchinger.
Good evening. The most serious news in the papers this and last week, aside from the British evacuation from Greece and the Nazi breakthrough at Tobruk, was the occupation of certain Greek islands by German troops. These islands include Samothrace and Lemnos, and they cover the western entrance to the Dardanelles. Two other islands, Lesbos and Chios, further south and still closer to the Turkish coast, are rumored to be occupied, or may be taken any day, unless the British fleet can prevent it. If it can't, the Germans will soon have a chain of Axis-controlled islands running all the way from the mouth of the Dardanelles to Italy's Dodecanese Islands on the southeastern Turkish coast. These islands can blockade all Turkish harbors except the remote and unimportant ones on the southern coast. Significant in this connection is the rumored passage of several merchant ships carrying German war materials from the Black Sea to the Aegean through the Turkish Straits, which could hardly have occurred without Turkish acquiescence. What these things portend is not difficult to guess, especially in view of the intense diplomatic pressure now being applied to the Turks. In any case, the conflict at the moment seems to be focusing on the historic waterway between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, consisting of the narrow Dardanelles at one end, the even narrower Bosporus at the other, and the Sea of Marmara in between, all collectively known as the Turkish Straits. The importance of that narrow channel of water in the fate of nations goes back to prehistoric times. This is indicated even in the mythology of the ancient Greeks. For Jason and his Argonauts sailed through the Hellespont, the Greek name for the Dardanelles, in search of the Golden Fleece, probably an ancient symbol for wealth. Control of the Hellespont, or Dardanelles, was the real issue of the Trojan War for the citizens of ancient Troy and of the cities that occupied the site before Troy, levied heavy tolls on the ships trading through the straits, bringing grain from the north shore of the Black Sea, now called the Ukraine, and tapping the trade routes to the Orient through the harbors along the southern shore. After the Battle of Salamis, which, as I mentioned last week, established Greek sea power in the Aegean, Athens controlled the Black Sea route, both by her fleet and by colonies, or bases, as we should say today, until the Athenian Empire was destroyed in the Peloponnesian War. To the Roman Empire, the Black Sea route was less important than to the Greeks, only because Rome traded with the East through Syria and Egypt, and the African colonies supplied it with grain. But after Rome declined and the Mohammedans cut Christian Europe off from these routes, the straits recovered their old importance for the Western world. Meantime, Constantinople had been built at the Bosporus as the capital of the Eastern Empire, and the Greek emperors had established complete control over the Mediterranean Black Sea route. The question of the straits has been a difficult European problem ever since. From the 11th century onwards, it chiefly concerned the sovereign trading cities of Italy, like Venice and Genoa, who competed bitterly for the privilege of navigating the straits. There was no such thing as the open door in those days. The Venetians went so far as to conquer Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade, after which they exercised an overlordship over the Black Sea. Then the Genoese helped the Greeks recapture their capital, and for some time they enjoyed a monopoly of the Black Sea trade. But in 1452, the Ottoman Turks took Constantinople, and the control of the straits passed into Muslim hands. The Turks had already conquered all of Asia Minor, the Balkans, and Greece. By 1457, the Black Sea had become a Turkish lake. Thanks to the construction of heavy guns, which was a novelty in the 15th century, the Turks were able to close the straits to all other nations. and the conquest of Egypt also gave them a monopoly of the East Indian trade. The Turkish monopoly of the Black Sea was maintained until the 18th century, when the Russian Empire established itself on the northern shore. The advent of Russia among the Black Sea nations changed the problem of the straits. It was Peter the Great who realized that the future greatness of Russia depended on access to a warm water sea. But it was a woman who first forced the Sultan to give up his exclusive control of the Black Sea, namely Catherine II. Catherine actually sent a fleet from the Baltic all the way around Gibraltar to blockade the Dardanelles from the west. 4 years later, the straits were opened to the merchant ships of Russia, and soon to those of other countries as well, including England and France. The Turkish commercial monopoly was broken at last, and trade of all kinds has flowed between the Mediterranean and the ports of the Black Sea ever since, at least in times of peace. But, besides being the great corridor of trade, the straits, as the link between two continents, have had great strategic importance both in ancient and modern times. Darius, the Persian king, crossed the Dardanelles in the 6th century B.C. to ravage European lands. His son Xerxes built his famous bridge of boats across them to march a mighty army into Greece. He chose a spot on the Narrows, just where the straits are only a mile wide, where Leander used to swim across to see his ladylove, Hero, and where the Turks erected their toll stations for less romantic purposes later on. The Turks, by the way, first crossed into Europe near the same place in 1354, though they didn't conquer Constantinople for another 99 years. Constantinople was built at the Bosporus, which in places is only 800 yards, to hold the European and Asiatic parts of the Greek Empire together. By means of this maritime fort, the Turks were able to keep all warships from passing through the straits. When the Russians became a Black Sea power, under Peter the Great, the Turks at first denied them the right to have a fleet. In fact, they beat them in a naval battle and forced them to disarm. But a century later, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, which was a Turkish possession, the Sultan in his fright called on the Russian Tsar for help. Russian warships entered the Bosporus and for a time passed freely in and out. Thereafter, Turkey might have been at the mercy of Russia, except for England. Napoleon's Egyptian adventure, you see, had for the first time aroused England's interest in the Near East. From then on, throughout the 19th century, England and Russia were the chief competitors for the control of those who controlled the straits, namely the Turks. Russia's ambition was to partition European Turkey and capture Constantinople. England's interest, later on, centered on the lands near the Suez Canal. For a long time, however, she was busy restraining Russia and, incidentally, keeping the Russian fleet inside the Black Sea. In 1809, Turkey's right to exclude warships from the straits was reasserted with England's support. Thus England, rather than Russia, became co-guardian of the straits. Then, in 1833, Russia sent a squadron to Constantinople to protect the Sultan in his troubles with Muhammad Ali, the rebellious Khedive of Egypt. And as a result, the Tsar wangled a treaty which seemed to give him the inside track. But England and France protested, and eventually the 5 great powers of Europe jointly engaged themselves to keep all warships out of both sides of the straits. That was the famous Straits Convention of 1841, which remained in force until the World War. Meantime, it became clearer and clearer that the unwieldy old Turkish Empire was crumbling. Russia, anxious to speed the process, made war on the sick man of Europe in 1854 and again in 1877. Both times the sick man was saved by the Western powers, who were not ready for the kill. But France occupied Tunis and England occupied Egypt, former Turkish territories both. In 1911, Italy made war and seized Tripoli, Turkey's last African possession, and then the Balkan states combined and took nearly all of European Turkey. Finally, the World War made an end of the old Turkish Empire. What remained was the new Turkish national state, confined to Asia Minor and a small piece of European territory near the Straits. The one country, ironically enough, which did not profit from the breakup of the old Turkey was Russia, who for over a century had considered herself the sick man's principal heir. Russia's share of the World War spoils were to have included Constantinople and the Straits. But the Bolsheviks renounced these imperial ambitions and later even helped the nationalist Turks in resisting the Allies. Meantime, in November 1918, an Allied fleet passed through the Dardanelles, and the Allies occupied Constantinople, considerably embarrassed as to what to do with it. After trying to persuade us, the United States, to accept a mandate over Constantinople and the Straits, they decided to internationalize them and demilitarize them under the Treaty of Sèvres. Thus, the problem of the Straits might have been solved for all time. But the new nationalistic Turkey was rising from the ashes of the decadent empire. The revolutionary government of Mustafa Kemal annihilated the Greek armies sent against him, and at a new conference in 1923 obtained free and secure possession of Constantinople and the demilitarized Straits. Once again, the Straits were to be free to merchant vessels of all flags, and from now on warships, too, might pass in a definitely limited number. The non-Black Sea powers were permitted to send enough, however, to keep Soviet Russia in check. But this, too, was altered in 1936, when Turkey, under the Montreux Convention, was once again made sole keeper of the Straits. In view of the international situation, with Germany rearming and Italy on the war path, Turkey was given the right to refortify the Straits and close them against belligerent war vessels in time of war. Moreover, Russia was given free passage into the Aegean for her warships in time of peace, while the warships of all other powers passing into the Black Sea were strictly limited so as not to exceed the Russian fleet. Thus, Soviet Russia profited from the Montreux Convention as well as Turkey herself. By making a friend of the new Turkey, Soviet Russia had come nearer to fulfilling the old imperial aspirations than the belligerent Russia of the Tsars. A new and sinister factor has now been introduced by the Nazis' push to the east. The Dardanelles are no longer an insurmountable problem to the modern military machine. Turkey, the ally of Britain under the Mutual Assistance Pact, is obviously not in a position to resist Germany without material help. Help could come only from England or Russia. Whether either or both of them would be adequate is more than doubtful. Without such help, Turkey has only the same alternatives which Yugoslavia and Greece had to face. The question, therefore, is not so much what will Turkey do, but what will Soviet Russia permit her to do? Or perhaps what the men of Moscow and Berlin will decide she must do after the present preliminary skirmishes are over and the new diplomatic adjustments have been made. For the present, only the Nazis' purpose is clear. They will not attack Turkey, oh no, if Turkey will only agree to become the base for an offensive through Iraq, where Rashid Ali's troops have just shelled the British airfield, through Transjordan and Palestine, while the Axis African forces push forward on the other side of Suez. And what will be the fate of the Turkish Straits? Will the Soviets, after all, revive the ancient imperial claim, or will they relinquish it to Germany and hope for compensation further east? Or will Turkey, by playing ball and careful balancing between rival forces, be able to maintain a precarious guardianship until the final decision at the end of the war? That, today, is the riddle of the Straits. Good night.
You have been listening to Caesar Searching Her, presented by the National Broadcasting Company in cooperation with the American Historical Association. Please remember that copies of these talks are available for 10 cents in stamps or coin by addressing the story behind the headlines, National Broadcasting Company, Post Office Box 30, Station J, New York City. Next Friday evening, Caesar Searching Her will be back with another story behind the headlines.
And they're coming down to the half-mile pole at the end of the backstretch, and it's still disposed, floating along 2.5 lengths in front, with Blue Pair running surprisingly good on the inside. In second place, a half a length in front of Porter's Cap, and he's 4 lengths in front of Starator, the outsider, with Our Boots driving hard and failing, dropping back, and Whirlaway is now making his dash in 5th place, and they're rounding the turn, and it is disposed, and Porter's Cap at his head. Disposed by half a length. Porter's Cap has got him, and Blue Pair is right there. Whirlaway is coming on the inside, and if he don't get blocked, he'll give him an awful drive. And Starator is right there. Porter's Cap is under a drive, heading for home. And Dispose is still there. Blue Pair cut the corner. Whirlaway has the lead by half a length. Porter's Cap has gone to a drive. It's Whirlaway by half a length, but Dispose is not yet beaten. No, Whirlaway pulls away. They've got 200 yards to come, and it's Whirlaway by 2.5 lengths. Porter's Cap is in second place. by 1/2 length, and on the inside, Market-Wise coming with a rush, but is whirled away, winning the race by 6 lengths.
It's H.V. Kaltenborn. Are you finding it hard to concentrate on your work these days? Then here's a suggestion for a quick cure. Get out in your car and go. But first, make sure your car is cured of its spring fever, too. Get that lazy, logy, winter-weary feeling out of your car with Pure Oil's complete bumper-to-bumper changeover service. Every car needs all these services to get set for summer driving, and your nearest Pure Oil dealer is the man to do the job right. You'll save time and money by putting your car in shape for summer the Pure Oil way, and you can get something for yourself besides. Pure Oil dealers are now offering a bargain as a bonus with their bumper-to-bumper changeover service. It's a fitted picnic hamper, a $2 retail value for only 98 cents with the changeover. See your Pure Oil dealer for details on how to get it at his station. And now, H.V. Kaltenborn.
Good evening, everybody. The President conferred today with his principal advisors on defense. He asked their advice on what must be done to speed the production of heavy bombing planes for Britain. On the basis of the advice he received today, the President knows that it is one thing to order more speed, but quite another to secure it. In the production of airplanes, we have reached the limit unless, and here is the unless. Unless materials now assigned to private manufacturers for private purposes are repossessed and turned over to airplane manufacturing plants. Unless trained technicians employed by private enterprise and in less essential defense enterprises are released to the airplane industry. Unless experienced foremen and supervisors trained in operations with some relation to aircraft production are made available to the airplane industry. Unless there is a cessation of strikes in plants producing airplane materials or airplane parts. Unless there is decisive action to force much more subcontracting throughout the aircraft industry. Unless the President can make much more clear than he has so far the immediate urgency of all these departures from our normal way of life. It is perfectly evident that the administration in Washington has received news which indicates that we must speed our help to Britain if it is to be made effective. Secretary of the Navy Knox and Secretary of State Hall have minced no words in telling us these things. Tonight, Secretary of War Stimson will have his turn, but no member of the Cabinet is able to speak as forcefully or as persuasively as the President himself. Britain's representatives in the United States and in Great Britain are doing their best to drive home the urgency of Britain's situation without striking any note of apprehension or panic. When the Premier of Australia arrives in the United States tonight from London, it is quite likely that he will seek to make clear to us the changed situation that results from Hitler's conquest of Greece and Yugoslavia. In London today, Foreign Secretary Eden appealed to the United States to use its influence to have air, give Britain Irish bases for the Battle of the Atlantic. The Foreign Secretary said, if Hitler wins there, he wins the war. Eden described Britain's position in relation to air as fantastic. He claimed that British use of bases at Berehaven and Lough Swilly would transform the submarine war overnight. His words on American help were these: the United States is today helping us greatly in many spheres and many ways. The more fully, the more rapidly, the more certainly that help can reach the battlefields in Asia, Africa, and Europe, the shorter will be the duration of the war. In the United States, Senator Pepper told the Senate that the American people are ready to spill their blood to prevent dictators from ruling the earth. He urged the United States to get tough by cooperating with Britain in the occupation of Greenland, Iceland, the Azores, the Cape Verde Islands, the Canary Islands, Dakar in West Africa, and Singapore in the Far East. On Singapore, he echoed the advice given to the United States by Hallett Abend, longtime New York Times correspondent in China and one of the ablest students of the Far East. In his book, Japan Unmasked, Abend says, once Japan makes an assault upon that key position, it will be too late for us to get there. We did not send our fleet westward to or toward Singapore because we feared such an action might anger Japan to the point of a declaration of war. Our refraining from action may go down in history as another blunder of the democracies, trying to avert an inevitable conflict. In the House of Representatives today, that body refused to prohibit the transfer of confiscated German and Italian ships to Great Britain. Members of the House declared before the vote that such a transfer would be an act of war and that it ought to be specifically prohibited before the House votes to authorize the confiscation of these ships. By a vote of 161 to 131, the House declared itself willing to face whatever risks were involved in that procedure. In both House and Senate today, it became evident that there is growing apprehension about the imminence of war. Joseph Stalin has replaced V.M. Molotov as Soviet Premier. Stalin has assumed his new duties as chairman of the Council of the People's Commissars, in addition to his position as General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Molotov will henceforth devote himself exclusively to his duties as Foreign Minister. On its face, this shift implies no change in Soviet policy. If anything, it emphasizes Russia's desire to remain neutral. Instead of working from behind the scenes, Stalin now steps to the front of the stage as the Soviet Premier. But we should remember that Stalin has personally participated in every important act of recent Soviet foreign policy. He favored Litvinov's policy of collaborating with the League of Nations on behalf of the principle of collective security, while that policy presented advantages to Soviet Russia. When Stalin saw that France and Britain, by their policy of appeasement, had strengthened the dictators, he turned to them. Litvinov was replaced by Molotov as Foreign Commissar. 4 months later, in August 1939, Joseph Stalin made the pact with Adolf Hitler, which cleared the way for the Nazi attack on Poland. This is what we mean when we say that Soviet Russia gave the signal for the beginning of the World War. As Premier of the Soviet Union, Stalin will serve as Chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. This means that he will preside over the sessions of the Russian cabinet and will be in the most direct touch with its actions and policies. It is quite possible that Molotov wished to be relieved of this burden. The Moscow radio, which a few hours ago announced Molotov's retirement, emphasized the burdens of his dual role. Foreign policy is now Soviet Russia's dominant concern. Hitler's advance in the Balkans threatens the peace of Russia. Stalin is under no illusion as to Hitler's purpose. He knows that before long, Hitler must have more oil and more food to remain the master of Europe. Russia has both. Stalin has the choice between two policies. He can continue to cooperate with Hitler in further acts of international brigandage. Europe's two powerful international highwaymen can agree to share Turkey, Syria, Iran, Transjordania, Palestine, India, or any combination of these territories. Turkey might even be brought into the partnership and given a share of the loot. This is probably the policy Stalin would like to adopt if he were sure of purchasing immunity from invasion by such a course. But he is not sure. Stalin's chief purpose is to remain at peace while preserving Russia's territorial integrity or expanding his domain. But we know that Stalin is seriously concerned over Germany's conquest of the Balkans. Every step that has been taken in foreign policy by Soviet Russia during the past few months indicates this apprehension. Russia seized Bessarabia and Bukovina from Romania without first receiving Germany's consent. She has continued to encourage Turkey to resist German aggression. She rebuked Bulgaria for permitting German troops to enter that country. She signed a mutual assistance pact with Yugoslavia a few days before Hitler invaded that country. She signed a non-aggression pact with Japan to be free in the Far East if and when Hitler attacks her in Europe. She announced that Hitler was sending troops to Finland, which Hitler himself denied. During the May Day celebration a few days ago, Stalin himself emphasized Russia's policy of defense against involvement in the war and a full mobilization of Russian strength against all surprises. Soviet troops have been transferred from the Far East to Russia's Balkan frontiers. As Premier, Stalin is in the best position to direct Russian mobilization. We must never forget that the Communist Party sees the present conflict as the second imperialist war in which the capitalist empires will destroy one another. And then, when the process is completed, Soviet Russia and the Communist Party will inherit the earth. That is why most Americans welcome today's decision to send no more machine tools to Germany. That is why most Americans will not weep because 100 Russian purchasing agents find no more to do in the United States and must now make their way home. That is why Americans will be wise to do no wishful thinking about today's news from Moscow. Haile Selassie is back in Addis Ababa, welcomed today by General Cunningham. The Emperor of Ethiopia has returned to his capital. The first ruler to be ousted from power by fascist aggression is the first to be returned to power. Great Britain, under Baldwin, tolerated the rape of Ethiopia in a vain gesture of appeasement towards the dictators. The Great Britain of Winston Churchill has restored Ethiopia's independence in a successful gesture of atonement. Thus, the first country to succumb to fascist aggression is also the first to be set free from fascist rule. Those who believe in the ultimate triumph of justice over force have the right to see a good omen in this historic restoration. Haile Selassie returns to his throne 5 years after he fled before the fascist invader. Even the Italians were able to conquer the barefooted, poorly armed Ethiopians. Personal bravery was no match for bombing planes and poison gas. Britain and France combined to sell out the League of Nations in Ethiopia. By driving Mussolini's fascists out of Ethiopia, Britain has eliminated the first unhappy consequence of the ill-fated appeasement policy. She has begun to make amends for the most mistaken foreign policy ever followed by the British Empire. Those of us who deplored and criticized that policy have the right to recall it, even at a time when Great Britain needs and deserves our sympathy and help. For there are men in Britain, just as in the United States, who continue to believe in appeasing dictators. Good night.
Be sure with Pure. The Pure Oil Company presents H.V. Kaltenborn.
More men have enjoyed White Owl than any other cigar ever made in the United States. This very night, May 9th, back in 1862, the ironclad Monitor was battling away in Hampton Roads. Indeed, that little Monitor, that cheese box on a raft, was driving a final nail into the coffin of every fleet in the world. Raymond Graham Swick.
Good evening. There is plenty of military news tonight, but probably the most important battle being fought at this moment is for the soul of the Vichy government. Admiral Darlan, Vichy's anti-British vice premier, left Vichy for Paris tonight after having failed to see Marshal Pétain. One report has it that the aged head of the French state is ill, but this is not confirmed, and all that is certain is that Darlan went back without having seen him and will renew his talks with Hitler's envoy in Paris, Herr Abetz. At the same time, the Vichy ambassador in Washington, after a conference with Assistant Secretary Wells, announced that the United States government has agreed to send 2 shiploads of wheat each month to France so long as the Vichy policy remains unchanged. But Henriet, the ambassador, put the situation too precisely, according to Secretary Hull, who told his press conference that no final agreement on this subject has been reached. The United States, he said, may send more wheat to unoccupied France soon, but he emphasized that the deal hinges on certain considerations which he did not specify, but which it can be assumed are that Vichy, in its collaboration with Germany and Italy, does not give direct or indirect military aid in the war on Britain. The German-controlled Paris newspaper Le Temps sums up the position by saying that Vichy must choose between its friendship for the United States and collaboration with Germany. Darlan has already carried discussions with the Germans to the point of agreement on 3 lesser concessions. 1, to open the frontier between the 2 French zones for the passage of goods and food. The others making it easier for persons and the mails to cross the border. He also held out hope of getting the cost of occupation reduced by $2 million a day. He has concealed what it is that Vichy has promised to do in exchange. Darlan, it should be remembered, favors collaboration with Germany. He's the one who ordered a French convoy and French land batteries to fire on British ships, which were examining French freighters recently. And he has been trying to demonstrate to the Germans that he is as apt a man as Laval to serve their interests. But he is not the one to make the final decision. That rests with Pétain. It may be that Darlan hopes to reach a settlement with Germany which not only will cut the costs of occupation, but will bring home to France the 2 million prisoners being detained in Germany as a kind of hostage, which Hitler holds from almost every family in France. He also wants to get French industry running again, which obviously can't produce unless Germany supplies the raw materials to some extent and takes the greater part of the output. But a German spokesman in Paris, quoted today, says he doubts that the Germans will make final peace with Vichy at this time. Why should it, he asks, when things are going well? If peace were made, Germany would lose its ability to bring pressure on France. It is reported that one of the German demands is that Axis troops should have the right of transit through France and French territory, and the use of bases in North Africa, Syria, and Dakar. At this stage of the war, these concessions would have an enormous effect on Hitler's chances of success in the Mediterranean and the Battle of the Atlantic. Even the admission of German civilians to Morocco, for instance, might lead to intrigues with the population which could shatter such strength as General Weygand has left. North Africa is a vital strategic position, and here the United States government is making an attempt to bolster up Weygand. It is preparing, belatedly, to start trade between French North Africa and the United States, which would at least bring to this country some cargoes which Germany has been getting and would be paid for with supplies which Weygand needs to maintain his military and economic strength. I should add that Ambassador Henriet said today that the food America would send to France would be distributed by the Red Cross, and that the British have agreed to pass it through the blockade. The British tonight published their shipping losses for the month of April. The total is 488,000 tons, the highest figure for any month of the war. It goes without saying that it is high because of the loss of shipping in and around Greece, and of the 43 Allied vessels sunk of 189,000 tons, a large share can be assumed to be Greek. The actual British losses are 60 ships of 293,000 tons. The figures are higher than those for February 1917, when Germany launched unrestricted submarine warfare. In that year, the losses mounted until they reached a figure in April of 852,000 tons. The British Ministry of Information issued the figures today instead of waiting until Tuesday because of the controversy which has arisen over the figures of Admiral Land of the Maritime Commission, which the British insist give a totally false picture, which, according to a statement from the White House tonight, were not compiled from official and secret information, but largely from newspaper reports. The British said that a grave danger exists that unless shipping losses are reduced, Britain's war effort and morale are likely to suffer for lack of food. No use could be made either of tanks or airplanes if food supplies fail, said the British statement. And this is the clearest British intimation in public that the British food supply is in some danger. Between 300 and 400 British bombers last night gave Hamburg and Bremen a full exposition of what such cities as Plymouth, Bristol, and Liverpool have been experiencing from Goering's Luftwaffe. It was Britain's greatest air effort of the war, and the German cities were systematically punished, in part by the new extra-destructive British bomb. Berlin and Emden had lesser raids. Nearly 1,000 tons of bombs were dropped on German objectives, a figure comparable to the great German raids. The British are gratified by the rising efficiency of their defense against night bombers. So far in May, they have brought down 86 German bombers. It is not clear how many of these are victims of the mystery night interceptor planes with their eyes that see in the dark, and how many can be attributed to the bright moonlight. But the British public hopes there is a chance that the Nighthawks may put a stop to large-scale night bombing by making it too costly, just as the daylight raiding was made too costly last fall. The British were able to announce the sinking in the Far East of the German raider Hansa, the former Hamburg American passenger liner, equipped with half a dozen 5.9-inch guns and torpedo tubes. In Iraq, the signs all point to an early collapse of Rashid Ali Bey, barring one incalculable possibility that Hitler sends him military help, perhaps by air from the Greek islands, where parachutists are known to be assembled. But it looks as though the conspiracy of the Axis in Iraq had been mistimed. It is too soon to say so definitely. When the British landed their troops at Basra, they may have forced Rashid's hand. Anyhow, this may be the second Axis miscalculation, the second out of the last two master intrigue, the first being Yugoslavia. For though Yugoslavia has been crushed, it must be remembered that the Hitler plan was to take it by diplomacy, and his own ambassador failed to judge the safety of the game, and he involved his master in the vast cost of an invasion. Two pronouncements come from Moscow today, which give a little insight into the core of Soviet Union foreign policy. One is a denial by the TASS agency of reports that the Soviet Union is placing on its western frontiers, especially along the Balkans and the Caspian Sea, forces which are being withdrawn from the Far East. Still more significant is the notification to the legations of Yugoslavia, Belgium, and Norway that their status in Moscow can no longer be recognized in view of the loss of sovereignty by their countries. To withdraw recognition from three governments which are continuing in exile their fight against the Axis is as frank and cordial a step in aid of the Axis as the diplomatic sign language is able to contrive. This puts the Yugoslavs in particular on the spot. They were so certain of the newly shown affection of the big Slav brother that many of them took refuge in the Soviet Union, and quite a few Yugoslav pilots flew their planes to Russian airports to keep them from falling into Nazi hands. So the notice today represents a sudden reversal of Soviet policy, and coming as it does after Stalin's acceptance of the premiership, it adds some credibility to the tales that Stalin is getting ready to make a big deal with the Germans. A sign that big changes are to be expected is the result of Stalin's policy as seen in Japan. The Times Advertiser, the organ of the Japanese Foreign Office, publishes a remarkable statement about peace with China. This looks like the first fruit of the Russo-Japanese Neutrality Pact, which Stalin personally negotiated. The Japanese organ advises Japan to abandon efforts to crush the Chongqing government by force. It says that the scale of hostilities in China should be reduced. China must become a partner in the co-prosperity sphere. It goes on to remark that the superiority of Japanese arms has been proved, but so has the ability of China to survive corporal punishment. And the opinion is expressed that if the Japanese armies withdraw, an advance of Chiang Kai-shek's armies would not necessarily follow. It seems reasonable to believe, it adds, that a shrinkage of the Japanese fighting fronts would lead to less and less hostility. And it concludes with the statement that the presence of the Japanese army in China should be proved to be no threat to China's political and territorial integrity. The soft-spoken words of Matsuoka's mouthpiece will have an appeal for some of the men around Chiang Kai-shek. And if Stalin should whisper to Chongqing that it had better make peace, so be threatening to withdraw Russian aid if peace isn't made, the Chinese war effort might end. It hasn't yet come to pass, but it is something to watch for.
From the studios of WTHT, the broadcasting division of the Hartford Times in Hartford, Connecticut, the Mutual Network presents Cedric Foster in a news analysis of today's developments in the European war. Cedric Foster.
The news out of Europe today is that the largest squadron of British bombing planes ever to raid Adolf Hitler's Third Reich struck terrific blows at Hamburg and Bremen last night, while Berlin and Emden were assaulted in what the British Air Ministry termed subsidiary attacks. The official communique from London did not give the number of planes involved in the raids, but there were estimates made today in the British capital that between 300 and 400 bombers and protecting fighters swung into action in the German skies. And probably the best way to describe what happened during this large-scale British attack is to quote for you directly the statement issued by the Air Ministry in London today. And this statement declares, more aircraft of the Bomber Command than ever before on a single night, with incendiaries to be counted in the tens of thousands and high explosives in hundreds of tons, covered Hamburg and Bremen with fires and smoke last night. Buildings were rent and smashed, and Germany's submarine and shipbuilding yards were remorselessly bombarded and left with fires blazing in their midst. The moon and the weather favored the attack, and though it was claimed by the Germans this morning that their defenses dispersed the attack, our aircraft were, in fact, prevented neither by night fighters nor anti-aircraft barrage from streaming over both cities in a constant procession and discharging their whole load on appointed targets. Pilots' individual reports speak of areas a mass of flame in which it was impossible to distinguish separate fire, of terrible explosions and smoke rising to 10,000 feet, and of our most powerful bombs dropped into the heart of the raging fires. That is the end of the official communique. In Britain today, there was an immediate reaction to this gigantic raid on German cities. It was interpreted in authoritative quarters to mean that the island fortress in the North Sea is now able to carry out heavy assaults on Nazi cities because of a gradual fulfillment of Mr. Churchill's prediction of last year. Many of you may remember his 4th of June speech, transmitted to the world on shortwave radio one Sunday afternoon, when the outlook was pretty grim and dark concerning Britain's ability to survive. France was almost under the heel of the conqueror. The Low Countries had been laid in waste, and the democratic world wasn't very optimistic as it looked toward the future. And it was at this time that Mr. Churchill chose to address his nation and empire, and the world will certainly never forget the peroration of that speech. It ranks with the greatest compositions of all time, and because it exemplifies the courage and the determination of the leader of the British Commonwealth of Nations, because through it he rallied his countrymen to their standard at a time when even the bravest and stoutest of hearts were weakening under the terrible strain of one disaster after another, I repeat his closing remarks to you now. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight on the seas and the oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence of strength in the air. We shall fight on beaches. We shall fight on landing grounds. We shall fight in fields, streets, and hills. We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it is subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, will carry on the struggle until in God's good time, the new world, with all of its power and its might, steps forth to the liberation and the rescue of the old. That was the statement of the British Prime Minister almost a year ago, and the words that he uttered have come to pass. His people are still fighting, and his island home has yet to be subjugated or starving. And the battle in the skies, carried on as he said that it would be, with growing confidence of strength in the air, is now being carried with increased power away from the shores of Britain to the homes and the industrial centers of the enemy. And there is not the slightest question that Britain has been enabled to do this because of the planes and the war material which she's received from the arsenals of the United States of America. And the Air Ministry didn't give too many details of the assault last night on Germany, but in addition to Hamburg, Bremen, Emden, and Berlin, there were other cities attacked which weren't named in northwestern Germany. Germany today admitted the severity of the attack. The Nazis stated that no bombs were dropped on their capital city of Berlin, but they declared that many civilians were killed in Bremen and Hamburg and other northwestern towns. At Hamburg and Bremen, the Nazis admitted what they termed some industrial damage, but they asserted that the residential sections of the two cities were the worst sufferers from the raid. While the Royal Air Force strafed Germany, the Nazis were causing havoc in the British Isles once more last night, particularly at the city of Hull on the northeast coast of England. Germany said that the entire city was clouded in smoke and ringed with fire, and this was the second successive night that the Germans have struck at this seaport, and the report from Berlin regarding the damage done is correct, because the British admitted last night that the city was badly hurt. Scores of business blocks had been demolished as well as homes, and the Germans used bombs of tremendous power. One explosive, according to British reports, dropped in the center of a residential street, and the force of the explosion was so great that it leveled every house in a city block. The German report of last night's raid on Hull quoted Nazi flyers as declaring that the flames from the burning seaport could be seen a distance of 70 miles. In discussing the British attack on Germany last night, the Nazis said that British planes roared on past Berlin to dip their wings over German-occupied Poland at the city of Posen. And this flight is the longest, or one of the longest, ever made by British bombers, because in order to reach that section of Poland and return to Britain, the RAF pilots had to guide their planes for more than 1,200 miles. In the Middle East today, Britain announced that she'd virtually completed the destruction of the Iraqi Air Force by direct hits on planes which were on the ground at 2 Iraqi landing fields. At the same time, it was announced that whatever troops the Iraqi army had used in the assault on the British airfield at Lake Habbaniyah These had been withdrawn to the towns of Ramadi and Fallujah, and this withdrawal, of course, was under fire. The Iraqis have steadfastly refused to accede to the British demands that they cease their attack on Habbaniyah. Cairo reports in connection with the campaign in Iraq that the British transported by heavy air howitzers from Egypt, or they transported heavy air howitzers from Egypt, and with these they routed the native troops of Rashid Ali. And the pursuit of these troops, according to Cairo, is now going on north and northeast of the Habbaniyah airport. And when the Iraqis abandoned their positions, the British said, they left large stores of war material which the Empire forces are now salvaging. In the vicinity of Basra, down on the Persian Gulf, quiet prevailed, according to the Cairo communique, while on the North African front at both Tobruk and Saloum, heavy sandstorms prevented the British and the British enemies from swinging into action. In the Western Mediterranean yesterday, the Italians said this morning that there was a heavy engagement between fascist planes and units of the British fleet which were guarding a large Allied convoy. Rome claims that 16 British planes were lost in the battle, and that in addition to this, torpedoes and bombs struck an aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, a destroyer, and 3 merchantmen as Italian aircraft roared to the attack. The battle, according to Rome, started late yesterday afternoon, and it went on into the hours of darkness. Rome declared that 5 Italian planes were lost. The Italians didn't say that any British ships had been sunk, but they stated that repeated hits were made on the naval vessels which were escorting the merchantmen. The British have yet to make any report on this engagement. The Admiralty in London, however, did send out cheering news to its fighting forces today when it reported the destruction of a German raider which was operating in the Indian Ocean. The ship was believed to have been the transatlantic liner Hansa, with a registry of more than 21,000 tons. The Admiralty's report of the battle, which gave but a few details, said that the British cruiser Cornwall took 27 British merchantmen seamen from the raider, where they had been held as prisoners by the Nazis. And in addition to these men, 53 members of the raider's crew were also picked up by the Cornwall. What happened to the others hasn't been announced, but it was thought that the normal complement of the raider was at least 300 sailors. Naval circles in London said today that the Hansa, which is well known or was well known in the transatlantic trade before the war, probably carried 6 5.9-inch guns, several torpedo tubes, and also mine-laying equipment. The speed of the ship was at least 19 knots. The Soviet Union today informed the ministers of Yugoslavia, Norway, and Belgium that they no longer have any official standing in Moscow. And after receiving this information, the representatives of these 3 countries, now under German domination through force of arms, prepared to leave the Russian capital. The news of Stalin's decision was telephoned to Berlin for transmission from the German capital to the outside world. But the moment that a correspondent declared on the telephone during the actual conversation that the Russian move was understood in diplomatic circles in Moscow to indicate that the Soviet is planning closer cooperation with Germany, the moment that this statement was made, the telephone line was cut. Now, this action on the part of the Soviet is the second official act of importance which has taken place since Joseph Stalin came out in the open to assume the premiership of the nation, which he's ruled as a dictator with an iron hand for many years. The first official move was a statement by TASS, Russian news agency, that the Soviet was not concentrating troops along the German frontier and that she has no intention of doing so. As far as Russia is concerned, there are 2 widely divergent points of view on her policy. And one view is that she's a sub-rosa partner of Adolf Hitler, and that she will work hand in glove with the Axis powers. And the other is that she's putting her house of diplomacy in order, and that she's determined to defend her interests in the Middle East. You may take your choice as to which you wish to believe. There are strong arguments on both sides, but when you've argued pro and con, you still come back to Mr. Churchill's definition of Russia. The British Prime Minister characterized her some time ago as a riddle wrapped in mystery inside of an enigma. Propaganda is one of the most powerful and potent forces in the war which is going on in Europe. And Germany makes full use of it. And she has stated, from the lips of her leader Adolf Hitler, that in order to conquer people, you must keep on repeating lies until those people believe them. And Germany today gave concrete evidence of her lying ability when she broadcast a report which referred to the communist newspaper in New York, which is the Daily Worker, as the representative of American labor. The German radio declared, and now I quote directly from the radio, "The American labor paper, New York Daily Worker, publishes an editorial dealing with the latest incendiary speech of War Secretary Stimson. The labor paper in its editorial points out that the American labor movement hates war. The Stimson speech," the New York newspaper remarks, "was the storm signal in preparation for the next step, when Roosevelt will push the button and set off the war explosion." The New York Daily Worker urges the American nation to take an open stand against these war machinations before it would be too late. That is the end of the German radio broadcast. Well, there's no doubt that the millions of American laboring people will be most interested to know that Germany has stated that the communist newspaper in New York is their representative. No more outspoken, deliberate lie has ever been uttered by authoritative German quarters. The statement is a perfect example of Adolf Hitler's policies being put into action.
Mutual has presented Cedric Foster an analysis of the news out of Europe today. Mr. Foster, speaking from the studios of WTHT, the Hartford Times in Hartford, Connecticut, is heard over most of these stations every day, Monday through Friday, at this same time. Cedric Foster is also heard Sundays at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
America Looks Abroad with your foreign correspondent, Robert Auden. Transcribed and presented each weeknight over these stations by the 12 Southern California offices of Dr. Cowan, the friendly credit dentist, whose main Los Angeles office is over the Owl Drug, 5th and Broadway. And now, Robert Auden.
Good evening. President Roosevelt, answering a direct question by a White House correspondent, said, and I quote, "The international situation is changing too rapidly from hour to hour and from day to day to allow to engage in a hypothetical discussion of what moves this government may find necessary to make." Now, in this terse statement, the President not only summed up the foreign situation as rapidly changing from hour to hour, but he also pointed out, inferentially, the great tragedy of the current situation, namely, that the initiative is entirely with the totalitarian Axis powers. It is one of the most widely discussed and certainly the most heatedly argued question what this country, what any other country can do to meet the challenge by the totalitarian Axis. Very frequently it is being proposed by one side or the other that the government of the United States either keep us out of war or enter the war without any further delay. But regardless of what course the individual favors, it seems almost hopelessly tragic to realize that only seldom, very seldom indeed, the basic truth is being given sufficient consideration. And that basic truth, inferentially mentioned in the President's statement, is simply this. The totalitarian Axis is the force of ruthless aggression, while the democratic or anti-Axis nations are obviously on the defense. It is not up to us, the people of the United States, or our government of the people, elected by the people for the people, nor, for that matter, is it up to any other non-Axis nation to determine whether to stay out of war or to enter into that current warfare. Totalitarian aggression, totalitarian expansion, totalitarian advance. Those are the only determining factors. And those factors are overwhelmingly in favor of the totalitarian lineup. The totalitarian dictator, may it be the Führer, Il Duce, or Tovarish Premier, he alone decides what to do next. His word is an order that is being executed without delay. His word is law, and that law is supreme. Under the democratic form of government, the procedure, by virtue of its traditional broad and many-sided liberties, must be much slower. Lengthy discussions, pro and con, use up much of valuable time, and by the time a majority reaches a decision, the totalitarian axis has usually moved into a spot where it is beyond the reach of peaceful procedure. Poland, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, and Greece are dramatically eloquent examples. There can be no doubt in anybody's mind today that nothing was further from the United States government intention than a possible occupation of or any other protective action against the French colony of Martinique, an island situated in the West Indies and thus within the Western Hemisphere. But now that the French government openly announced its cooperation with the Axis, such a move might become not only necessary, but imperative for the security of our own shores. In Martinique, there are over 110 American-made airplanes, several French men of war, and over $60 million worth of gold. If the French cooperation with Nazi Germany goes beyond the economic political limits, and there can be no doubt that it will, since France has very little in those fields that Hitler's regime would consider a vital necessity, Martinique will have to be occupied either by a United States or other American force. And such a move, as is quite clear, is not the result of any aggressive policy on the part of the United States or another American nation, but merely the after effect of a totalitarian threat. It is quite evident by now that all present efforts made by the totalitarian powers are openly directed against the United States and indirectly against the other American republics. All the violent protestations made by the Axis propaganda ministry, to the contrary, are just so much smoke released to screen the real and deadly fear the Axis lineup has of an American, or rather a Pan-American intervention. Any move of the United States would be followed by at least 18 of the other American sister republics. The two exceptions will be discussed at a later date. Now, such a joint action, apart from its material importance, would have a tremendous moral repercussion not only in Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, but also in every single one of the European countries now living under the heels of their Nazi conquerors. The material importance would be twofold. First, it would mean genuine, all-out aid to Great Britain and all other countries which decide to fight and resist an Axis aggression. Based upon the entire resources of the Western Hemisphere, industrial, economic, and natural resources, such material aid would soon reach proportions far beyond anything we or the totalitarian powers dare to think of. But, secondly, it would mean the end to one of the most important sources of revenue for totalitarian propaganda abroad. In case of a joint Pan-American action against the totalitarian Axis, Nazi Germany and her Axis partners would face the loss by seizure and outright confiscation of all their investments, ships, airplanes, industrial plants and patents, mines and plantations, newspapers, and so-called diplomatic missions, which, as is well known, are nothing else but an endless chain of Nazi spy and propaganda organizations. Nazi Germany, of course, cannot afford to lose all that. At present, Hitler has taken everything the Washington administration has seen fit to do or say with reference to the totalitarian Axis. But the Nazis simply cannot afford to lose their diplomatic representations in this country. Why, I shall tell you in a moment after we have heard a word from Neil Reagan.
Frequently, the expression is heard, you can never afford to neglect your teeth when you can always afford to see Dr. Cowan. There's a great deal of meaning behind this phrase because in the highly competitive world of today, a man or woman is often judged by appearance, and probably no single factor contributes a greater impression of self-respect than well-cared-for teeth, an impression that you can seldom afford to neglect. Furthermore, it isn't necessary to practice such neglect here in Southern California because almost regardless of your income or present financial condition, any one of the 12 Dr. Cowan friendly credit dental offices stands ready to assist you toward greater success by supplying good, careful, thorough dental care on time payments. These Dr. Cowan terms of payment are offered with no extra charges of any kind, purely as a means of making necessary dentistry immediately available to those who might otherwise have to endure extended dental neglect. Neglect that is always costly and often dangerous. If you would like to learn just what dentistry you need, how much such care would cost, and how you may arrange to pay for this work after you receive its benefits, call on your nearest Dr. Cowan Friendly Credit Dental Office tomorrow. There is no obligation for prices in advance, and all 12 offices are open every evening. The main address in downtown Los Angeles over the Owl Drug, 5th and Broadway. Look for the name Dr. Cowan. And now back to Robert Arden.
The Nazis simply cannot afford to lose their diplomatic representations in this country or all throughout the Western Hemisphere because these pseudo-diplomatic missions procure enough money to finance all the propaganda in Central, South, and North America. They produce the information about sailing dates and cargoes of ships en route to England by posing as insurance companies. They furnish information, and very detailed information, about the progress of America's preparedness and materials ready for transshipment to England. And, what's more, they function as brain centers from which emanates the nefarious propaganda which tries to split the American people into many warring factions and thus make them vulnerable to sudden attack. The so-called Hess mystery, which is still occupying a central spot in the day's news, is a very fine example of Nazidom's determination to undermine the American people's confidence in their government and to destroy their unity of thought and action. It has been pointed out to me by a usually well-informed source that Hess might have been the most important factor in current and future developments had it not been for one of those peculiar quirks of fate which sometimes spoil gigantic plans by minute obstacles. In the Hess case, it seems that a sprained ankle was the fatal obstacle. Hess, there can be no doubt about that, made his trip with the full knowledge and sanction of Hitler and the Nazi Big Four. No one else but the fanatically devout Hess would have been willing to undertake such an important and dangerous mission, and no one else but Hess would have carried more enthusiasm to his undertaking, which was aimed at removing the one and only factor which the Axis fears, namely American, or rather Pan-American intervention. Hess, so I was told, apparently tried to contact the Duke of Hamilton, whom he had known for many years, believing that the Duke would be easy to convince of the futility of further bloodshed between England and Nazi Germany, and thus perhaps be easily induced to head an appeasement party in England. Now imagine the effect of a hypnotizing and dramatic appearance of Rudolf Hess, Nazi number 3, at a meeting of appeasers in the Duke's Scotland castle. Then there would have been little to fear from publicizing such a meeting, and perhaps actually reach another Munich, or worse. Can you imagine what effect that would have had on this country? What would have happened to all the countless billions of dollars invested in war industries, all the workers who had just returned to some measure of security and prosperity, all the young men who had given up their jobs to prepare themselves for the defense of their country and its traditional democracy? Yes, indeed, every anti-Nazi, every ardent advocate of the principles of democracy, every defender of American way of living would have become a warmonger. It is almost impossible to think that eventuality through to an end, and it must be admitted that, as a plan, that thought has great probabilities. The Nazis of all people must be given credit for being capable of hatching such a far-reaching coup, which went amiss because Herr Rudolf Hess sprained his ankle and was captured by a Scotch farmer with a pitchfork before he could slip into Hamilton Castle undetected and unidentified. The Hess case, of course, is far from being closed, and any day may bring the revelation of something else. But regardless of what that information is going to be, there was a definite plan, and that plan was definitely directed against the United States. It was a supreme coup tried by the Nazi regime, only this time luck was with the democracies. And like Achilles' heel, Hess's ankle may go down in history as another important accident. The situation on the battlefronts in the meantime is changing rapidly. the British forces have retaken Salam, the vital outpost on the Egyptian frontier. That military victory may turn out of far greater importance than appears on the surface. First, it indicates that the Axis forces, which claimed an advance of at least 40 miles into Egypt, nearly into the region of Sidi Barani, have been thrown back at least that far. And secondly, it makes any Axis attempt to break the British defenses at Tobruk less likely to succeed. At this moment, it seems as if General Wavell is beginning to test his strength. And after finding it sufficient, he may soon give the signal for a counterattack on Libya. And that will be of enormous importance, particularly in view of the sudden change in the Vichy government's attitude towards Nazi Germany. It must not be forgotten that this change was motivated directly by the fact that the Nazis were able to occupy almost all of Europe and that France could not possibly see any hope in an attempt to resist Nazi pressure. The British had retreated from Greece, and apparently they were in a bad spot in the Near East and North Africa. Now, if the British forces can repeat their successes of a few months ago, General Weygand may have a chance to act on his own without having to listen to Darlan and Laval. But in the meantime, American Coast Guardsmen lost no time and took under protective custody 13 French ships in American waters, among them the superliner Normandy at her New York pier. Franco-American relations at present seem near the breaking point, and the plans to send monthly shipments of wheat to France were cancelled today. Ambassador Admiral Leahy may be recalled at any moment. It looks grim, but at least promising. Au revoir.
Each evening, Monday through Friday at 7:45, America Looks Abroad with your foreign correspondent, Robert Arden. A radio feature presented over these stations by Dr. Cowan, the friendly credit dentist, whose offices offering every type of dentistry on credit terms are located in 12 communities from Ventura to San Diego, including Long Beach opposite Buffalo. Until Monday evening at 7:45, may we remind you that you can never afford to neglect your teeth when you can always afford to see Dr. Cowan. This transcribed program originated in Warner Brothers Hollywood studios.
The World Today. At this time, the Columbia Broadcasting System calls on its correspondents in important European capitals for the latest news on the diplomatic, economic, and battle fronts. Tonight, direct by transatlantic shortwave radio, you shall hear from Harry W. Flannery in Berlin, Lee White in Sofia, and Edward Murrow in London. But before going abroad for the latest news, here is a summary of Press Association reports from other points. From Athens comes a Greek government spokesman's report that a new counterattack by the Italians in the Albanian coastal sector had met with a fate worse than any yet tried. The Italians are said to have launched the attack with large forces and to have been repulsed with such heavy losses that they retreated in confusion. The spokesman said the Italians have not had time to reorganize their positions. From Vichy come reports that Pope Pius XII has renewed his peace drive in the hope of bringing a settlement of the war. The pontiff is reported to have instructed Cardinal Gellier, Archbishop of Lyon and Primate of France, to strive for a Franco-German peace as the first step toward ending the war. It is reported that the Cardinal has had a series of conferences within the last few days with Marshal Pétain and other French cabinet officers. Tokyo reports that an armistice between Siam and French Indochina was signed today aboard a Japanese warship in Saigon Harbor, and that peace negotiations would begin soon in Tokyo. Now for the news direct. First from the German capital, Harry W. Flannery reporting. Go ahead, Berlin.
This is Berlin. Our German newspapers tonight continue to give main attention to the speech yesterday afternoon by Adolf Hitler. The German radio quoted from other newspapers in all parts of Europe, as well as in Russia and Japan. The Berlin local Anzeiger, commenting on the address, said that the warning to the United States had been well understood on the other side of the ocean. Indicative of the importance attached to this part of the talk was the fact that one of the German radio broadcasts tonight quoted these passages at length, including the phrase, in connection with help to Britain, that every ship, whether with or without escort, that comes within range of our torpedoes will be sunk. Official circles in Berlin this afternoon, commenting on the Hitler speech, said that this threat applied only to the war-blocked waters about England. At the same time, it was noted that De Geer made no comments on the recent Roosevelt speech, had nothing to say directly about the so-called Lend and Lease bill, and generally speaking, made few references to the United States. As far as Germany is concerned, it doesn't appear tonight, therefore, that the situation in connection with the United States has been changed by the address. In connection with reports in English and Swedish newspapers that Wendell Wilkie had been invited to come to Germany, it was said in official quarters tonight that Wilkie had not been given any such invitation, and that if he had, he would probably have refused it. Nevertheless, continued the William Straussy comment, Wilkie would have found it extremely interesting to visit Berlin, since it was said there had been no air raid of arms here since December the 21st. The official news agency DNB also busied itself with a denial tonight. This was that the BBC claimed that Germany had attempted an invasion of England. Germany did not undertake any invasion effort of England either last month or last September, said the news agency. 3 air raid alarms were reported in London today. An early official German news announcement said the small units of the German Air Force attacked a number of militarily important objectives in London and nearby in the course of this forenoon and the early hours of the afternoon. Another German news announcement tonight claimed that a German long-distance bomber attacked a 5,000-ton merchant vessel 100 miles west of the Hebrides about noon today. Then an hour later, a second steamer of over 5,000 tons was attacked 250 miles off the Scottish coast. It was said that both ships were so effectively hit that they went down within a short space of time. Further activity of German planes in the Mediterranean War was announced. The Italian communique said that German planes bombed Suez and Ismail in the Suez Canal. No further details were given. Chancellor Hitler was reported to have received a delegation of members of the Imperial Japanese Army in the new Reichschancellery today. The delegation, headed by Lieutenant General Yamashita, has been making a tour of inspection of special institutions and branches of the German Army and Air Force, and is expected to visit the Western Front battlefields later. Members of the Hoover Commission, after having made a tour of Belgium and the Netherlands in connection with relief there, were reported tonight ready to meet in Berlin for discussions. Another note is that Tchaikovsky's opera, The Sorceress, was heard in the State Opera House in Berlin tonight in its first presentation outside of Russia and possibly the first anywhere in decades. Sorceress failed when first given in Russia, principally because it was boycotted on moral grounds and has not been attempted since. This is Harry W. Flannery, returning you to Columbia, New York.
Jurgen's Journal, featuring Walter Winchell, America's one-man newspaper. His famous column appears in the New York Daily Mirror and over 725 other newspapers, from New York to Shanghai, China. He's here with flash news, odd news, exclusive news. Walter Winchell is brought to you by Jurgen's Lotion, the lotion for soft, smooth, romantic hands. As one gardener to another, Mrs. Beatrice Clark of Seattle writes,
"You don't have to try to hide your hands at the bridge table during gardening season. I used to. But now I use Jurgen's lotion regularly, and my hands are beautifully smooth."
Mrs. Clark says other lotions fail to help her, but Jurgen's lotion does the trick. You see, when you're working outdoors with your hands often wet, your hand skin begins to lose its natural lubricating moisture and looks coarse and crackly and feels rough. But when you apply Jurgen's lotion, you furnish your unhappy skin with new, refreshing, softening moisture. Jurgen's lotion smooths on quickly, never feels sticky. Many clever women keep a second bottle of Jurgen's in the kitchen, handy to use after every use of water. Try this yourself if you want to be proud of your charming feminine hands.
But be sure and use our favorite Jurgen's lotion.
And now to the editorial room of the Jurgen's Journal and Walter Winchell.
Good evening, Mr. North and South America, and all the ships and clippers at sea. Let's go to press. Flash, London. The terms of surrender for the Italian army in Ethiopia have just been handed to Mussolini's representatives. This will give England about 38,000 prisoners, bringing the number of Italians captured in Ethiopia to 200,000. London. Reports persisted in England today that the wife of Rudolf Hess has been arrested by the Nazi police. Akron, Ohio. A big strike in the Goodrich rubber plant here was called off today when CIO workers agreed on a 6-cent raise in pay per hour. The government today is trying to settle 18 defense strikes. Boston, Massachusetts. The condition of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was hurt today in a motor car crash near Walpole, Massachusetts, is not serious. The president's boy, an ensign in the Naval Reserve, turned over when a tire blew out. Philadelphia. The G-men are investigating the $1 million shipyard fire today, which caused the death of Michael Regan, the watchman. Regan was found on the piles of wreckage at the yard, which deals mainly in defense work. Police believe Regan was murdered by saboteurs. New York. It's a baby boy for the Fortune Peter Ryans at the Doctors Hospital, New York City. She is the former Anne Royal of New York, and Mount Kisco and the New York Social Register. It is also a baby girl for the George Henrys at the same hospital, the doctors. Washington. The federal agents and the police arrested aliens all over the nation during the weekend. The coast-to-coast total was 169 arrests. 92 of the aliens were arrested in New York City, 28 in Florida, and 15 in San Francisco. New York. The most thrilling spectacle in the history of New York was Mayor LaGuardia's I Am an American Day rally in Central Park today. The mayor said it was the biggest crowd in the history of the nation to attend a patriotic rally. Over 675,000 people. In Chicago, William Newton spoke before 125,000 Americans. France. Little River, South Carolina. An excursion boat by name the Nightingale, an excursion boat, reported carrying employees of the Rocky Mount plant of the Orange Crush Bottling Company, exploded in the Atlantic Ocean. It happened 7 miles offshore. 7 persons are reported killed, and several others may have drowned. Coast Guard boats are on the scene. The name of the boat, an excursion boat, is the Nightingale. The passengers, employees of the Rocky Mount plant of the Orange Crush Bottling Company. It happened in the Atlantic Ocean. Behind the international scene, Washington. These are believed to be the Nazi battle plans for the Near East and Africa. Syria is the base for 3 pincer movements. To the north against Turkey, to the southeast against Iraq, and to the south against Palestine and Suez. The first drive will be southeast on Iraq, where the heavily outnumbered British face precisely the same situation as Greece and Dunkirk, except that the British Navy faces the trip around Arabia 2,500 miles. Russia is expected to push south from the Caspian area to the Persian Gulf at the very same time. From the left flank will come heavy reinforcements of Nazis through French North Africa for the drive on Egypt. With Suez mopped up, all Nazi forces will unite, and the drive west on the Atlantic will start against Gibraltar and Dakar, only 1,600 miles from South America. London. For practical purposes, the Hess flight is of no importance. Its cause is his aversion to Russia. Hess is said to have made this comment. Comrade in Russian means kamerad, which is surrender, in German. Lisbon. Turkey is lost to England as an ally. Eden's belief that Turkey will resist is discounted in most diplomatic circles, and that Turkey's resistance would be futile is accepted by all the experts. Vichy. United Press yesterday revealed this attitude by the Vichy government. It was explained that France was grateful for American food, but that this American aid, said France, was very little and unimportant. In fact, the word used was infinitesimal. Ladies and gentlemen, here is the absolute lowdown. How only a few shiploads of food to France helped the war effort of the Germans. 10 shiploads a week, amounting to 50,000 tons sent to France, would replace in calorie values 187,500 tons of potatoes, from which could be extracted 16,875 tons of alcohol, which would free 11,000 tons of gasoline, and that would enable 250 bombs and 250 Nazi fighting planes to raid London every night for 2 months. Attention, Mr. and Mrs. United States. At any given time, there can be only one President of the United States. Constitutionally, he is charged with the responsibility of our foreign affairs, which means that morally, his policies are entitled to your support. Last fall, the American people knew that democratic institutions were under worldwide attack, and the captain they picked for our ship of state was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The dictators were fools. They had predicted disaster. But the American way was strong enough to hold an election in the middle of a crisis. The dictators seek to prolong that crisis to divide us. To the intense disappointment of Joe Goebbels of Berlin, Wendell Willkie stands by the American way. The candidate de Willkie opposed as Franklin D. Roosevelt, he loyally supports as President of the United States. At the election, Wendell Willkie had won the votes of many. Since the election, he has won the respect of all Americans by forfeiting a Nazi medal forever. Mr. Willkie set an example of working democracy. He has shown the dictators that the leader of a large minority will wholeheartedly support a leader elected by a small majority. But more important, Wendell Willkie has shown the principal resource of democracy. In the showdown, ladies and gentlemen, Roosevelt can depend upon a Willkie, while Hitler has only a head. The Walter Winchell Warmonger Department, for the edification of Mr. and Mrs. Rip Van Winkle, from border to border and coast to coast. Los Angeles. Attention, Toledo, Ohio. A few weeks ago, I reported that one Kenneth Eggert of Toledo was allegedly one of the agitators of a strike against the defense plants on the West Coast, and that this very same Eggert was a communist troublemaker. Eggert demanded a copy of Winchell's remarks and threatened to sue me for my called malicious lie about him, etc., etc. The Dice Congressional Committee sends me the following information. That Kenneth Eggert, alias Eggert, or Eckert, was issued a passport to go to Russia on November the 3rd, 1932, and that the files of the State Department also reveal that the passage to Russia of this communist-inspired strike agitator was paid for by the Communist Party. Washington, D.C. On Wednesday next week, the Dice Committee will start hearings on communistic activities in Washington, D.C. Mr. Dice says he will thoroughly discredit the American Peace Mobilization outfit which has been picketing the White House. Mr. Dice says he will expose that group as being a Communist Party line, not a picket line. Washington. Last Sunday night, ladies and gentlemen, I reported exclusively that government agents would arrest a certain rabble-rouser who had allegedly sent threatening letters to innocent Americans. His initials, for the time being, are D. S. ABCD. S. He really does the dirty laundry for many big-name Nazi lovers in the United States. He and his files, containing many letters from his supporters and backers, have been seized. Congratulations, Mr. Government Man. Jersey City, New Jersey. A few months ago, I reported the peculiar activities of a major in the United States Army Intelligence Service. His name is Major John E. Kelly of 14 Brinkerhoff Street, Jersey City. I said at the time that he was associating with some very strange people for a member of Army Intelligence because I knew he was not spying on them in the interest of his America. This is to report further, ladies and gentlemen, on Major John E. Kelly, USA, and a dear, dear pal of the Nazis. On May the 16th, 1941, the United States Army dropped Major John E. Kelly of Jersey City. And now, Mr. Ben Grauer and Company for Jergens Lotion. I'll be back in a flash with a flash.
A young girl we know just almost had a sad disappointment. She tried out for her senior play, and everyone said she was sure to have the leading part. But the other day, the coach told her he'd have to give the lead to another girl, and he was kind enough to say why. The part represented a lovely, sophisticated woman, and our little friend's hands were, well, rather rough and grubby. She was shocked and almost heartbroken, until one of her friends advised her to use Jergens lotion and use it faithfully. In a few days, her hands looked so much smoother and softer. Yes, she got her part, but even more, she learned the importance of charming hands for a girl and how well and quickly Jergens lotion helps you. Jergens lotion is almost like professional hand care, you know, only easy and inexpensive and never sticky. 2 of Jergens' fine ingredients are skin beautifiers used by many doctors for treating ill-used and harsh skin. 50 cents, 25 cents, 10 cents, $1 at any beauty counter. Start now to cultivate attractive hands with this famous Jergens lotion. And now back to the editorial room of the Jergens Journal and Walter Winchell.
New York, by NBC shortwave listening post. London radio tonight reported that the Spanish cabinet will meet tomorrow and be reorganized in a way to give Serrano Suna, the foreign minister of Spain, wider powers. To give to Hitler, of course. London. Scandinavian reports reaching London said that thousands of newspapers were given away today in Norway on the occasion of National Day. The Nazis there tried to suppress those newspapers, which printed a message from King Haakon. Hundreds of loyal Norwegians have been arrested by the Nazi Gestapo. Attention, men. The Navy confirmed last Sunday night's story about accepting men between the ages of 17 up to 50. 50. The Navy especially wants machinists, carpenters, radio operators, radio technicians, and yeomen. Those enlisting in the Naval Reserve will be released from duty when the emergency is over. And that, ladies and gentlemen, winds up another edition of the Jergens Journal until next Sunday night at the very same time. Until then, and with lotions of love, I remain your New York correspondent, Walter Winchell, who reminds you of the great difference in 2 systems of government. Rudolf Hess preferred to bail out over Britain than be out on bail in Berlin. Good night.
Maybe you don't realize it, but every type of woman's skin has natural beauty. You can smudge yours by the wrong shade of face powder, or you can bring it gloriously to light. Wear the new Jergens face powder in the shade designed specially for your skin tone by Alex, the great fashion creator. Alex has styled all 5 shades for the new Jergens face powder, which clings like a natural bloom. Try this exciting new Jergens face powder yourself. $1 a box. Introductory sizes 25 cents and 10 cents. Ask at your beauty counter for Jergens face powder. And tune in again next Sunday for another edition of the Jergens Journal featuring Walter Winchell, brought to you by Jergens, the lotion for soft, smooth, romantic hands. This is Ben Grauer speaking.
Das Oberkommando der Wehrmacht gibt bekannt. Ein im Atlantik operierender deutscher Flottenverband unter Führung des Flottenchefs Admiral Lütjens stieß im Seegebiet um Island auf schwere englische Seestreitkräfte. Das Schlachtschiff Bismarck hat hierbei einen englischen Schlachtkreuzer, wahrscheinlich Hood, vernichtet. Das Oberkommando der Wehrmacht gibt bekannt. Ein im Atlantik operierender deutscher Flottenverband unter Führung des Flottenchefs Admiral Lütjens stieß im Seegebiet um Island auf schwere englische Seestreitkräfte. Das Schlachtschiff Bismarck hat hierbei einen englischen Schlachtkreuzer, wahrscheinlich Hood, vernichtet.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My fellow Americans of all the Americas, my friends, I am speaking tonight from the White House in the presence of the governing board of the Pan American Union, the Canadian minister, and their families. The members of this board are the ambassadors and ministers of the American republics in Washington. It is appropriate that I do this, for now as never before, the unity of the American republics is of supreme importance to each and every one of us and to the cause of freedom throughout the world. Our future independence is bound up with the future independence of all of our sister republics. The pressing problems that confront us are military and naval problems. We cannot afford to approach them from the point of view of wishful thinkers or sentimentalists. What we face is cold, hard fact. The first and fundamental fact is that what started as a European war has developed, as the Nazis always intended it should develop, into a war for world domination. Adolf Hitler never considered the domination of Europe as an end in itself. European conquest was but a step toward ultimate goals in all the other continents. It is unmistakably apparent to all of us that unless the advance of Hitlerism is forcibly checked now, the Western Hemisphere will be within range of the Nazi weapons of destruction. For our own defense, we have accordingly undertaken certain obvious, necessary measures. First, we have joined in concluding a series of agreements with all the other American republics. This further solidified our hemisphere against the common danger. And then, a year ago, we launched and are successfully carrying out the largest armament production program we have ever undertaken. We have added substantially to our splendid Navy, and we have mustered our manpower to build up a new army, which is already worthy of the highest traditions of our military service. We instituted a policy of aid for the democracies, the nations which have fought for the continuation of human liberties. This policy had its origin in the first month of the war, when I urged upon the Congress repeal of the arms embargo provisions in the old neutrality law. And in that message of September 1939, I said, I should like to be able to offer the hope that the shadow over the world might swiftly pass. I cannot. The facts compel my stating with candor that darker periods may lie ahead. In the subsequent months, the shadows did deepen and lengthen, and the night spread over Poland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. In June 1940, Britain stood alone, faced with the same machine of terror which had overwhelmed her allies. Our government rushed arms to meet her desperate needs. In September 1940, an agreement was completed with Great Britain for the trade of 50 destroyers for 8 important offshore bases. And in March 1941, this year, the Congress passed the Lend-Lease Bill and an appropriation of $7 billion to implement it. This law realistically provided for material aid for the government of any country whose defense the President deems vital to the defense of the United States. Our whole program of aid for the democracies has been based on hard-headed concern for our own security and for the kind of safe and civilized world in which we wish to live. Every dollar of material that we send helps to keep the dictators away from our own hemisphere, and every day that they are held off gives us time to build more guns and tanks and planes and ships. We have made no pretense about our own self-interest in this aid. Great Britain understands it And so does Nazi Germany. And now, after a year, Britain still fights gallantly on a far-flung battle line. We have doubled and redoubled our vast production, increasing month by month our material supply of the tools of war for ourselves and for Britain and for China, and eventually for all the democracies. The supply of these tools will not fail. It will increase. With greatly augmented strength, the United States and the other American republics now chart their course in the situation of today. Your government knows what terms Hitler, if victorious, would impose. They are indeed the only terms on which he would accept a so-called negotiated peace. And under those terms, Germany would literally parcel out the world, hoisting the swastika itself over vast territories and populations, and setting up puppet governments of its own choosing, wholly subject to the will and the policy of a conqueror. To the people of the Americas, a triumphant Hitler would say, as he said after the seizure of Austria, and as he said after Munich, and as he said after the seizure of Czechoslovakia, I am now completely satisfied. This is the last territorial readjustment I will seek. And he would, of course, add, all we want is peace and friendship and profitable trade relations with you in the new world. Were any of us in the Americas so incredibly simple and forgetful as to accept those honeyed words, what would then happen? Those in the New World who were seeking profits would be urging that all that the dictatorships desired was peace. They would oppose toil and taxes for more American armament. And meanwhile, the dictatorships would be forcing the enslaved peoples of their old world conquests into a system they are even now organizing to build a naval and air force intended to gain and hold and be master of the Atlantic and the Pacific as well. They would fasten an economic stranglehold upon our several nations. Quislings would be found to subvert the governments in our republics, and the Nazis would back their fifth columns with invasion if necessary. No, I am not speculating about all this. I merely repeat what is already in the Nazi Book of World Conquest. They plan to treat the Latin American nations as they are now treating the Balkans. They plan then to strangle the United States of America and the Dominion of Canada. The American laborer would have to compete with slave labor in the rest of the world. Minimum wages, maximum hours, nonsense. Wages and hours fixed by Hitler. The dignity and power and standard of living of the American worker and farmer would be gone. Trade unions would become historic relics, and collective bargaining a joke. Farm income? What happens to all farm surpluses without any foreign trade? The American farmer would get for his products exactly what Hitler wanted to give. And the farmer would face obvious disaster and complete regimentation. Tariff walls, Chinese walls of isolation would be futile. Freedom to trade is essential to our economic life. We do not eat all the food we produce. We do not burn all the oil we can pump. We do not use all the goods we can manufacture. It would not be an American wall to keep Nazi goods out. It would be a Nazi wall to keep us in. the whole fabric of working life as we know it, business and manufacturing, mining and agriculture, all would be mangled and crippled under such a system. Yet to maintain even that crippled independence would require permanent conscription of our manpower. It would curtail the funds we could spend on education, on housing, on public works, on flood control, on health. And instead, we should be permanently pouring our resources into armament. And year in and year out, standing day and night watch against the destruction of our cities. Yes, even our right of worship would be threatened. The Nazi world does not recognize any God except Hitler. For the Nazis are as ruthless as the communists in the denial of God. What place has religion, which preaches the dignity of the human being, the majesty of the human soul, in a world where moral standards are measured by treachery and bribery and fifth columnists? Will our children, too, wander off, goose-stepping in search of new gods? We do not accept, we will not permit this Nazi shape of things to come. It will never be forced upon us if we act in this present crisis with the wisdom and the courage which have distinguished our country in all the crises of the past. Today, the Nazis have taken military possession of the greater part of Europe. In Africa, they have occupied Tripoli and Libya, and they are threatening Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the Near East. But their plans do not stop there, for the Indian Ocean is the gateway to the Farther East. They also have the armed power at any moment to occupy Spain and Portugal. And that threat extends not only to French North Africa and the western end of the Mediterranean Sea, it extends also to the Atlantic fortress of Dakar and to the island outposts of the New World, the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. Yes, these Cape Verde Islands are only 7 hours' distance from Brazil by bomber or troop-carrying planes. They dominate shipping routes to and from the South Atlantic. The war is approaching the brink of the Western Hemisphere itself. It is coming very close to home. Control or occupation by Nazi forces of any of the islands of the Atlantic would jeopardize the immediate safety of portions of North and South America and of the island possessions of the United States, and therefore of the ultimate safety of the continental United States itself. Hitler's plan of world domination would be near its accomplishment today were it not for 2 factors. One is the epic resistance of Britain, her colonies, and the great dominions, fighting not only to maintain the existence of the island of Britain, but also to hold the Near East and Africa. The other is the magnificent defense of China, which will, I have reason to believe, increase in strength. And all of these together are preventing the Axis from winning control of the seas by ships and aircraft. The Axis powers can never achieve their objective of world domination unless they first obtain control of the seas. That is their supreme purpose today, and to achieve it, they must capture Great Britain. They could then have the power to dictate to the Western Hemisphere no spurious argument, no appeal to sentiment, no false pledges like those given by Hitler at Munich can deceive the American people into believing that he and his Axis partners would not, with Britain defeated, close in relentlessly on this hemisphere of ours. But if the Axis powers fail to gain control of the seas, then they are certainly defeated. Their dreams of world domination will then go by the board, and the criminal leaders who started this war will suffer inevitable disaster. Both they and their people know this, and they and their people are afraid. That is why they are risking everything they have, conducting desperate attempts to break through to the command of the ocean. Once they are limited to a continuing land war, their cruel forces of occupation will be unable to keep their heel on the necks of the millions of innocent, oppressed peoples on the continent of Europe. And in the end, their whole structure will break into little pieces. And let us remember that the wider the Nazi land effort, the greater is their ultimate danger. We do not forget the silenced people. Masters of Germany, those at least who have not been assassinated or escaped to free soil, have marked these silenced peoples and their children's children for slavery. But those people, spiritually unconquered, Austrians, Czechs, Poles, Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians, Frenchmen, Greeks, Southern Slavs, yes, even those Italians and Germans who themselves have been enslaved, will prove to be a powerful force in the final disruption of the Nazi system. All freedom, meaning freedom to live and not freedom to conquer and subjugate other peoples, depends on freedom of the seas. All of American history, North, Central, and South American history, has been inevitably tied up with those words, freedom of the seas. Since 1799, 142 years ago, when our infant Navy made the West Indies and the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico safe for American ships, since 1804 and 1805, when we made all peaceful commerce safe from the depredations of the Barbary pirates, since the War of 1812, which was fought for the preservation of sailors' rights, since 1867, when our sea power made it possible for the Mexicans to expel the French army of Louis Napoleon, we have striven and fought in defense of freedom of the seas. Freedom of the seas for our own shipping, for the commerce of our sister republics, for the right of all nations to use the highways of world trade, and for our own safety. During the First World War, we were able to escort merchant ships by the use of small cruisers and gunboats and destroyers, and that type, called convoy, was effective against submarines. In this Second World War, however, the problem is greater. It is different, because the attack on the freedom of the seas is now fourfold. First, the improved submarine. Second, the much greater use of the heavily armed raiding cruiser or the hit-and-run battleship. Third, the bombing airplane, which is capable of destroying merchant ships 700 or 800 miles from its nearest base. And fourth, the destruction of merchant ships in those ports of the world that are accessible to bombing attack. The Battle of the Atlantic now extends from the icy waters of the North Pole to the frozen continent of the Antarctic. Throughout this huge area, there have been sinkings of merchant ships in alarming and increasing numbers by Nazi raiders or submarines. There have been sinkings even of ships carrying neutral flags. There have been sinkings in the South Atlantic, off West Africa, and the Cape Verde Islands. between the Azores and the islands off the American coast, and between Greenland and Iceland. Great numbers of these sinkings have been actually within the waters of the Western Hemisphere itself. The blunt truth of this seems to be this, and I reveal this with the full knowledge of the British government. The present rate of Nazi sinkings of merchant ships is more than 3 times as high as the capacity of British shipyards to replace them. It is more than twice the combined British and American output of merchant ships today. We can answer this peril by 2 simultaneous measures. First, by speeding up and increasing our own great shipbuilding program, and second, by helping to cut down the losses on the high seas. Attacks on shipping off the very shores of land which we are determined to protect present an actual military danger to the Americas. And that danger has recently been heavily underlined by the presence in Western Hemisphere waters of a Nazi battleship of great striking power. You remember that most of the supplies for Britain go by a northerly route, which comes close to Greenland and the nearby island of Iceland. Germany's heaviest attack is on that route. Nazi occupation of Iceland or bases in Greenland would bring the war close to our own continental shores, because those places are stepping stones to Labrador, to Newfoundland, to Nova Scotia, yes, to the northern United States itself, including the great industrial centers of the North, the East, and the Middle West. Equally, the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands, if occupied or controlled by Germany, would directly endanger the freedom of the Atlantic and our own American physical safety. Under German domination, those islands would become bases for submarines, warships, and airplanes raiding the waters that lie immediately off our own coast and attacking the shipping in the South Atlantic. They would provide a springboard for actual attack against the integrity and the independence of Brazil and her neighboring republics. I have said on many occasions that the United States is mustering its men and its resources only for purposes of defense, only to repel attack. I repeat that statement now. But we must be realistic when we use the word attack. We have to relate it to the lightning speed of modern warfare. Some people seem to think that we are not attacked until bombs actually drop in the streets of New York or San Francisco or New Orleans or Chicago. But they are simply shutting their eyes to the lesson that we must learn from the fate of every nation that the Nazis have conquered. The attack on Czechoslovakia began with the conquest of Austria. The attack on Norway began with the occupation of Denmark. The attack on Greece began with occupation of Albania and Bulgaria. The attack on the Suez Canal began with the invasion of the Balkans and North Africa. And the attack on the United States can begin with the domination of any base which menaces our security, north or south. Nobody can foretell tonight just when the acts of the dictators will ripen into attack on this hemisphere and us. But we know enough by now to realize that it would be suicide to wait until they are in our front yard. When your enemy comes at you in a tank or a bombing plane, if you hold your fire until you see the whites of his eyes, you will never know what hit you. Our Bunker Hill of tomorrow may be several thousand miles from Boston, Massachusetts. Anyone with an atlas, anyone with a reasonable knowledge of the sudden striking force of modern war knows that it is stupid to wait until a probable enemy has gained a foothold from which to attack. Old-fashioned common sense calls for the use of a strategy that will prevent such an enemy from gaining a foothold in the first place. We have accordingly extended our patrol in North and South Atlantic waters. We are steadily adding more and more ships and planes to that patrol. It is well known that the strength of the Atlantic fleet has been greatly increased during the past year, and that it is constantly being built up. These ships and planes warn of the presence of attacking raiders on the sea, under the sea, and above the sea. The danger from these raiders is, of course, greatly lessened if their location is definitely known. And we are thus being forewarned. We shall be on our guard against efforts to establish Nazi bases closer to our hemisphere. The deadly facts of war compel nations for simple preservation to make stern choices. It does not make sense, for instance, to say, I believe in the defense of all the Western Hemisphere, and in the next breath to say, I will not fight for that defense until the enemy has landed on our shores. If we believe in the independence and the integrity of the Americas, we must be willing to fight to defend them just as much as we would fight for the safety of our own homes. It is time for us to realize that the safety of American homes, even in the center of this, our own country, has a very definite relationship to the continued safety of homes in Nova Scotia or Trinidad or Brazil. Our national policy today, therefore, is this. First, we shall actively resist wherever necessary, and with all our resources, every attempt by Hitler to extend his Nazi domination to the Western Hemisphere. As a military force, we were weak when we established our independence, but we successfully stood off tyrants, powerful in their day, tyrants who are now lost in the dust of history. Odds meant nothing to us then. Shall we now, with all our potential strength, hesitate to take every single measure necessary to maintain our American liberties? Our people and our government will not hesitate to meet that challenge. As the president of a united and determined people, I say solemnly, we reassert the ancient American doctrine of freedom of the seas. We reassert the solidarity of the 21 American republics under the Dominion of Canada in the preservation of the independence of the hemisphere. We have pledged material support to the other democracies of the world, and we will fulfill that pledge. We, in the Americas, will decide for ourselves whether and when and where our American interests are attacked or our security threatened. We are placing our armed forces in strategic military positions. We will not hesitate to use our armed forces to repel attacks. We reassert our abiding faith in the vitality of our constitutional republic as a perpetual home of freedom of tolerance, and of devotion to the Word of God. Therefore, with profound consciousness of my responsibilities to my countrymen and to my country's cause, I have tonight issued a proclamation that an unlimited national emergency exists and requires the strengthening of our defense to the extreme limit of our national power and authority. The nation will expect all individuals and all groups to play their full part without selfishness and without doubt that our democracy will triumphantly survive. I repeat the words of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. That little band of patriots, fighting long ago against overwhelming odds, but certain, as we are now, of ultimate victory, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, the world has heard the President of the United States, who spoke tonight from the East Room of the White House. Delivering the fireside chat was arranged after the cancellation of his remarks planned for the Pan American reception in honor of the President and Mrs. Roosevelt.
Be sure with Pure. The Pure Oil Company presents H.V. Kaltenborn. Regardless of what you buy, you, like everyone else, appreciate more for your money. An extra, a plus value, something over and above what you actually pay for. And believe me, you get it when you use Pure Oil's famous solvanized gasoline, Pure Pep and Wokopep. The explanation is simple. Here it is in a nutshell. First, solvanized Pure Pep and solvanized Wokopep are top-quality gasolines. Then, to every gallon, we add Pure Oil's exclusive chemical combination that combats excess carbon in your motor. It actually cleans as it burns. While you're driving, this chemical extra is helping that solvanized gasoline to give your car more power, more pep, better all-round performance. For these extra benefits, you pay no more. Solvanized Pure Pep and solvanized Wokopep sell at the price of regular. Doesn't it all add up to a good common sense buy? Try it. Drive in tonight or first thing tomorrow at the big blue and white Pure Oil sign. Remember, it costs no more to be sure with Pure. Now, here's H.V. Kaltenborn.
Good evening, everybody. The important thing to remember in connection with the sinking of the German battleship Bismarck is that she was discovered, pursued, located, and crippled by aircraft. Chief credit for finding the Bismarck is given to an American-built PBY-5 flying boat. These planes have a cruising range of 5,000 miles, and like American bombers, need no convoys or patrols or shipping space to get them across the Atlantic. And today the President asked Congress for another $3.5 billion to manufacture more bombers and more flying boats. To build a Bismarck takes over 4 years and costs something like $80 million. But the time will soon be here when a bomber can be completed in less than 4 months, and the bomber costs only $100,000. On the same day on which we hear of the sinking of the Bismarck, Britain reveals that the Germans sank 4 cruisers and 2 destroyers with their bombing planes in the Battle of Crete. Here, too, superior air power was more important than superior sea power. Surface navies are still important. But sea power, without air power, has lost its historic might and mission. And in a crisis where speed is essential, bombers must precede battleships. Despite losses, the British Navy is still in action at Crete. It is reinforcing the British and preventing seaborne German forces from reaching Crete. But it does so at great risk. The Germans, with their control of the air, today report hits on several additional British warships. Fierce fighting continues in western Crete, where the Germans continue to have the upper hand. The British may have to give up the western half of the island and concentrate their remaining forces in the eastern half. Vichy today made a new pledge to the United States. A note delivered by the French ambassador pledges France will not surrender her fleet or her colonial empire to the Germans. But suppose the Germans take them as they took the Syrian airdromes. Vichy is not a free agent, and we must remember that in appraising any promises Vichy may make. The dominant topic in Florida and Georgia, where I have just made a brief stay, is the power shortage. Everywhere there are appeals to the public through poster, press, and radio to conserve power. An unprecedented drought, joined to an unprecedented defense demand, have created a critical situation. In many homes of the Southeast, the need to economize power will bring the first real sacrifice for defense. The private power companies of the Southeast are today eagerly looking towards the completion of new additions to that TVA power whose creation they once condemned as wasteful duplication. Today, every prominent power company of the Southeast is joining with the Tennessee Valley Authority in widespread advertisements urging everyone to economize in the use of electric current. Air conditioning may have to go, daylight saving may be extended, and the sale and use of power-consuming appliances may be curtailed. Some 40 Georgia mayors will meet in Atlanta tomorrow to launch a United Save Kilowatts program. Chairman McDonald of the Georgia Public Service Commission says it has come down to a plain question of whether we will run our air-conditioned plants for comfort or build airplanes for our safety. In Pensacola yesterday, I visited the most complete naval air training station I have seen so far. The last time I saw Pensacola, it was a sleepy, charming little Gulf town. Its municipal transportation system consisted of one car, one mule, and one Negro driver. When the system met me on the main street, the driver hailed me. This was early in 1899, and I was a soldier in uniform. "Sergeant," he called, "you all want a ride?" "Sure," I said, "but you're going the wrong way." "That's all right, boss," he answered. "I'll turn around." He unhitched his mule, hitched it to the other end of the car, and off we went. I thought of that first Pensacola ride yesterday as I enjoyed another in a huge Navy amphibian transport plane which carried me over 2 training stations, a Navy yard, 2 coast artillery forts, and some 30 airfields in a 15-minute flight around the shores of Pensacola Bay. Pensacola is an ideal base for naval aviation. It has the bay and the Gulf for seaplanes, 30 strategically located landing and practice fields for land planes, and a deep water harbor big enough to hold the Atlantic fleet. Hundreds of aviation cadets are arriving each month, and at Pensacola, they really learn how to fly. I was particularly impressed with the ground school training, which the boys don't like, but which is just as essential as learning how to fly. They have learned one thing at Pensacola, that you can save many a young flyer from failure by teaching his teacher how to teach. Not every good flyer is a good teacher. By teaching teachers and eliminating men unfit for teaching, the Pensacola station has reduced eliminations by 1/2. While I was waiting yesterday to board a naval plane, an aviation cadet, landing on the field, jammed his brakes too hard and crashed. His plane nosed over on top of him. A siren sounded from the control tower, and in 30 seconds, an ambulance, a control car, and a wrecking car were alongside the plane. Within a minute, the cadet was on his way to the hospital for a checkup. And within 3 minutes, the wrecked plane was tilted right side to and on its way to the hangar. And all the time, scores of other planes took off and landed in routine fashion. I also visited Fort Barangas and Fort Pickens and saw the Army teach selectees how to shoot a 12-inch gun. Practically everything in the way of armament at Fort Pickens is out of date, but the Army has wisely decided to put this fort way at the bottom of the priority list. We don't propose to wait until an enemy sails into Pensacola Bay before tackling him. The men I saw training at Fort Pickens will soon man our new defense stations in the Caribbean, and someday they may be sent to islands even further out in the Atlantic. Ambassador Wynant is on his way home from London for important consultations. He reaches New York by clipper on Friday. He will bring important information and may carry important decisions back to London. Clipper service across the Atlantic makes possible those complete private man-to-man exchanges which even the transatlantic telephone cannot provide. Tonight, the President will speak to 130 million Americans by radio. No previous president has ever been able to do that at a time when this nation faced the risk of war. Few American presidents could have used radio with the persuasive skill of Franklin D. Roosevelt. But tonight, something more than skill and persuasion is needed and expected. We are waiting to hear what the President will say. We know that he will say it well. This speech would make history, no matter how poorly it might be delivered. But it comes at a turning point of one of the world's great wars, and it will outline, in more or less definite terms, the policy which this nation will follow towards that war. Many people believe we are already in this war. Others believe that we are committed to this war. Still others see definite and clearly defined limits to this commitment. There is still a considerable age short of war party which honestly believes that the President himself has it in his own hands to so limit and circumscribe our aid to Britain that we need not run the risk of war. 7 congressional isolationists, headed by Senator Wheeler, today sent a letter to the President warning him against the use of convoys and any direct naval action which might mean war. The President's answer was to call the congressional leaders of both parties to the White House late this afternoon for a review of the talk to the nation which he will deliver tonight. The isolationists had warned the President in their letter today that 80% of the people of the United States, quote, are opposed to any course which will take this nation into the European war, end quote. They remind him that under the Constitution, only Congress can declare war. But the letter of the isolationists says nothing about the Lend-Lease law, under which, by the vote of 3/4 of Congress, we are definitely committed to aid Britain. It warns the President, but suggests no alternative course of action under which he could carry out the duty which Congress has assigned to him of providing all-out effective aid to the British. The small group of isolationists in Congress have told the President what he should not do. This evening, the President gave the duly selected leaders of both parties in Congress the opportunity of telling him what they think he should do. In the course of human history, there are times when doing nothing may be more disastrous than doing something. There are times when a council of mere negation is not enough. The true leader is almost always the man of action. Speaker of the House Rayburn, after hearing the President read his speech, told him he approves it 100%. That's the first reaction to what the President will say to you tonight. Tonight's hour in history recalls other hours faced by other presidents when decision hung in the balance. American presidents are traditionally averse to war. No president has deliberately led this nation into war against the wishes of Congress and the people. But there are instances, beginning with the anxious days that preceded the War of 1812, when a war-minded America pushed a reluctant president into belligerence. That was true in 1812. And in the anxious weeks that preceded the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln prayed and hoped and struggled to avoid the steps that would bring war between the states. It was not the forces under his command that fired the first shots at Fort Sumter. For months, the peace-minded McKinley struggled against the Jingos who demanded war against Spain, only to yield at the very moment when he had Spain's surrender in his hand. Many of you remember the abuse heaped upon the head of Woodrow Wilson, the scholar president who talked of peace without victory and sought to avoid war for the United States in a last great effort to bring about a fair and enduring peace in Europe. So when you listen to the President tonight, don't forget that he has taken counsel with many of our best minds. The great majority of our people has shown again and again that it trusts him, particularly in his conduct of our foreign affairs. The majority of our people has approved the policy of giving practical, effective help to Britain in the belief that this policy at least gave us a chance of avoiding total war. For in this at least, the isolationists are right. The American people do not willfully want war. The division that is among us arises because we differ as to the best ways of keeping every kind of war away from the Western world. which we have vowed to protect against aggression. And that means aggression by secret propagandists, saboteurs, fifth columnists, trade stealers and spies, as well as open military aggression. When your enemies are Nazis, you must define what is true peace and what is sneaking war. Feeling in Washington tonight is serious. The mood of the president is serious, as you will realize when he begins to speak. But the man who speaks tonight was chosen as the sovereign voice of the American people. He is your president and mine. Good night.
Members of ENSA have entertained in the last few months officers and gallant men on the Hood. You will feel as I feel about their last great gallant sacrifice. But the British Navy has in all its decades of history taken good care to avenge things of that kind. And that is why this morning at 11 o'clock the Bismarck was sunk.
Ladies and gentlemen, workers, playtime! We have particular pleasure in introducing in Workaday Time for the second time two famous stars of stage screen. And here they are, in Doris Waters, otherwise Earthman Daisy.
Hello, girls, how are you? All right? All right? Hello, boys, how are you? That's right. How are you? I'm all right. Anyway. Come here. Let's have a look at you. Is your face still, or is it my imagination?